Thanks for coming in and talking to us. I'm Ethan. My question is, the climate change movement got started, I guess, with organizations like Greenpeace that were, maybe definitely not theological, and often more on the highly left-wing, highly anti-religion side of the political spectrum. So could you discuss the internal dynamics of the climate change movement right now and how you are situated and what your engagement is like with groups like Greenpeace and Sierra Club, who are maybe not necessarily about religion and more for environment's sake? Are you having more success with their religious message? Are they having more success with their climate-only message? And what's the future of that dialogue, and is there prospects to work together?
Funny, when I was still in Minnesota, but working with and hearing from colleagues who were representing organizations from other states, we'd come to DC once or twice a year for conferences and to have meetings on the Hill. And our secular environmental organization colleagues would say, and this is like mid to late 2000, or like around 2007, 2008, so before the recession hit. The secular environmental organization people would say, we've tried for decades to get people of faith on board with the environment message. You've only been doing this seemingly for the last 5 to 10 years, and you're making huge strides. How'd you do it? And by and large, the faith leaders said, because you finally let us do it ourselves, which I thought was really fascinating. So we had to own it for ourselves. We had to reach pretty deep into our own theology. And you saw some of that in your readings for this week. I mean, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has a statement. The LCA has a social statement on not only caring for creation, sufficient sustainable livelihood, but also an economic one. And there's a theologian, Joseph Sittler, who was talking about this in the early 1900s. For the Catholics, St. Francis of Assisi called all of the plants and animals on earth his brothers and sisters, which is why in that tradition, and still in many of the mainline Protestant traditions, we have a blessing of the animals every fall. So I think part of it is that we've started to own it for ourselves, and now that a lot of the mainline Protestant and some of the Catholic groups are doing that, I think you're seeing some of the more conservative denominations just starting to do some of that as well. I mean, there's just a long line of, these faith traditions do not move quickly. What you said made me think of something else. Other part of your question I didn't yet answer.
Like long-term engagement together.
Long-term engagement together. I was at a meeting a couple months ago with the secular environmental group, and they were talking about, instead of calling this movement about climate change, making it climate justice, so making it a human rights movement and taking it completely out of the environmental sector. I thought that was fascinating because it's essentially what the faith groups have been trying to do for the last several years. And in the 1.5 hours I was listening to people talk, I did not hear a mention of faith groups once. So it felt like that was a little bit of a slap in the face. And there was a fellow from the Catholic Coalition on Climate Change who was also there, and he did a really good job of pointing out, this person was from Europe, this person spearheading this movement, and so very different scene in Europe. But we said, if you're going to address any sort of climate human rights thing in the U.S., you have to include faith groups. That's our history, right? Civil rights movement was based in faith communities. So this Catholic guy did a really good job of, Dan Misla is his name, pointing out that when there was comprehensive legislation on the table in 2010, the folks who made the strongest arguments and were the biggest advocates for mitigation and adaptation funding in this legislation for developing nations were the faith groups. And you'll see that if we see any more legislation. It will include any version of a carbon tax, energy efficiency, anything you see will include from faith groups protecting the poorest of the poor and providing adaptation and mitigation funds for developing nations, because those who've least contributed to the problem are those who are bearing the biggest brunt. So there's collaboration, but sometimes the movements need to operate in parallel, and they're usually pretty respectful of one another.